All right, hello wine friends. My name is Johnny. I'm an advanced sommelier through Quartermaster Sommeliers. I've been a somm now for 9 years, and my only regret is I didn't start learning about wine earlier enough. My goal here is to help wine education just be a bit more palatable for you. All right, it's that time of year again. Super Bowl 55 is upon us. Kansas City Chiefs, Tampa Bay Bucks. I don't have a dog in the fight. But what I do have is some wines, and I don't know about you. A lot of people drink beer, a lot of people have cocktails, a lot of people have whiskey. Being a somm, I always like to have a nice glass of wine on Super Bowl Sunday. Now, what kind of wine do I like to have? I always enjoy wine with a little bit of bubbles. A lot of people are drinking beer, and I want to still have that carbonation too. The other great thing about sparkling wines is that they typically always are high in acid. And they can have a range of different sweetness levels. And what makes sense for that is that a lot of the foods that we do serve on Sunday, guilty as charged, have a lot of kind of fattiness to them. Also, some things can be quite spicy, which I love spice in my life, and a little bit of residual sugar in some of the sparkling wines will really help kind of cleanse the palate of all those different things and really make that kind of extra yumminess in Super Bowl Sunday. Now, before we jump into sparkling wines for today, I'd like to just mention how wine is even made as a basic formula. You have yeast, you have sugar, they make alcohol, and as a byproduct of that, we have CO2, carbon dioxide. Now, where we get the sparkling wine is we find different ways to keep that CO2 in the wine. The couple of different methods that I'm going to discuss today are the traditional method, or the champagne method, or method champenois, a couple different ways to say it. This is naturally, as the name says, it comes from Champagne, France. Now, it's legally defined. You can't call anything else champagne unless it comes from Champagne, France. So there's your one quick fact for the day. Other regions in France do make the same style of wine, but they call it Cremant. And you might find Cremant de Bourgogne, which is from Burgundy, Cremant de Bordeaux from Bordeaux, or Cremant de Alsace, hence from Alsace. The second method I'll talk about is Méthode Ancestrale. It came centuries before the champagne process was legally defined, and these wines typically are a little bit lighter in alcohol and have some residual sugar to them in most cases, and are a lot more rare to find, but are findable. The last method that I'll touch on is the Charmont method, or the tank method. This is a more efficient way of making wines. A lot of regions will produce these styles of wines in bulk or mass production, and two common regions that you'll see from this is Prosecco or Moscato d'Asti. All right, everyone, first method we're going to talk about today is the champagne method. My example today will be a Robert Moncueille Le Grand Blanc. This is a Grand Cru champagne that's a non-vintage. Before we jump into that, let's talk about how the champagne process is even done. So first thing, one kind of thing that makes it a little bit more expensive than some of the other wines is that it legally has to be hand harvested. Now, an alternative to that would be, say, Prosecco or Moscato d'Asti, or just two small examples of where you would use a machine to mechanically harvest. So that means you and I in Champagne are going out to the vineyards ourselves to harvest these grapes. Then the first fermentation will happen in various different vessels, whether that be steel or oak or cement. And then the main part of champagne is that the second fermentation, where we capture the bubbles, is that has to happen in bottle, and it has to happen in the bottle that it's going to be sold in. During that same process where we're capturing those bottles in that second fermentation, that's also an aging process where we can legally define whether it's going to be a non-vintage or a vintage champagne. After the second fermentation, the bottle goes through a process called riddling, where basically it starts on its side and we turn it over X amount of months, and it eventually gets to Sur Point, where it's almost upside down, and then I take the top or the top of the champagne, which is now upside down, where all those yeast cells are captured, and I'll put it in a brining solution, a freezing solution. I'll pop that off. I do lose some of the champagne, but that's where our dosage comes in, which determines our sweetness level, which is a major factor in buying champagne as well. So going back to vintage versus non-vintage, this is a non-vintage champagne, so legally defined, that's got to be 15 months aged on those yeast cells, and a vintage champagne has to be more than double that at 3 years. At 18 months of lees aging, or this aging on these yeast cells, lees are these decomposed yeast cells. That's where you start to see that real influential aspect to it in terms of the flavor of the wine. So when you are buying retail, that will be a big thing between non-vintage and vintage champagne. Non-vintage champagne is a basic house style of a champagne house, and is meant for kind of everyday drinking and so forth, or aperitifs. Vintage champagne is where you're going to get these more characterful wines, much more depth to the wines, and they tend to drive the prices up a little bit more. There's also a few other styles. There's something called Blanc de Blanc, which is the champagne is made from only white grapes, and in most cases you're going to see it made from Chardonnay. Another style is called Blanc de Noir, which is made from the two red grapes, the Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier. And then there's single vineyard styles, and then there's also rosé. Rosé is and the way the champagne, rosé is made in Champagne, is the only legally defined region in France where white grapes can be blended with red grapes to actually make a rosé wine. All the other regions go through a process called saignée, where I take the grape clusters and I literally bleed the juice out to get the color. There's a few different regions as well. There's Montagne de Reims, which is the mountains, which you might see on the label. This is higher elevation. They tend to be more structured champagnes. There's another area called the Vallée de la Marne, which is has a different soil aspect, which Pinot Meunier really likes, and they tend to be a little bit softer champagnes. And then you have the Côte de Blancs, which is Chardonnay land. That's really elegance and finesse that comes into that. So when you are going to your shelves, it's important to know what you're actually celebrating, what you're actually looking for. You're on a nice date with someone or so forth. So again, non-vintage champagne being a nice house style. Under those non-vintages, you can get any of those various different styles that I did mention, Blanc de Blanc, Blanc de Noir, and so forth. And then if you're really looking to celebrate something, maybe a vintage champagne coming from a single harvest, or a prestige cuvée, which is the top line of those champagnes. The most notable prestige cuvée that I can mention to you, if everyone's familiar with Moet and Chandon, in 1936 they released their first vintage of Dom Perignon. All right, and as my example of our champagne method, I have Robert Moncueille Le Grand Blancs. This is a Blanc de Blanc, non-vintage Chardonnay Grand Cru. It comes from two villages within the Côte de Blancs, that Chardonnay land that I mentioned. Those villages are Le Mesnil-sur-Oger and Oger. This wine is aged about 18 months on its dead yeast cells, or those lees. So there's a little bit of that toastiness and breadiness to it. And then its first fermentation that I talked about, the different vessels, this one actually goes through neutral barrels. So there's less of a wood impact to it, although it does allow the wine to kind of evolve through the champagne process. So when I do taste the wine or smell the wine, swirling it in the glass, you'll also notice I have a regular wine glass for this. I love to drink champagne just out of regular wine glasses. Flutes are great, and there's different styles of flutes, but they don't give you all the aromatics that I really like to pull out of the wines. So when I do jump into this glass, right out of the gates, from that aging it does on the yeast cells, there's this toastiness and breadiness to go along with a little bit of lemon curd and citrus fruits. This wine, again, is Blanc de Blanc. It is made from 100% Chardonnay. So the wine has this really elegance and softness to it. Really pairs nicely with charcuterie. Maybe like your Parmesan chicken wings or something like that. Or even like a nice white pizza, which is really, really cool with some Parmesan and maybe some truffle oil would be really nice. So our second method we're going to talk about today is the Méthode Ancestrale, or ancestral method. This style of making sparkling wine was created, or was kind of almost an original way of creating sparkling wine, where it goes through its first fermentation in whichever vessel you so choose, and then they just bottle the wine. But they bottle it with not all the sugars all the way fermented. So while it's making its way to your retail shelf, it will continue to ferment in the bottle. And these wines overall typically tend to be a little bit lower in alcohol and also tend to have some residual sugar. The example that I have for us today is Bugey-Cerdon. This is by Patrick Bottex. La Cueille is the particular vineyard site that it comes from. Bugey is a village that's in the Savoie region in the French Alps. The grapes that go into this wine are Gamay and Pulsard. It's made with 90% Gamay, and that grape is most commonly found in the Beaujolais region of Burgundy. Overall, these wines are beautifully fruity. You can see this lovely pink color to it. Nice wild strawberry notes to it. And again, it's got that little bit of residual sugar to it. Gosh, and I don't know about you, but some sweet and spicy wings are right up my alley with this guy. And a third and final method that I'm going to talk about, and I'm really just going to mention this because you see it a lot on your retail shelves and your restaurants and so forth and at parties, is the Charmont method or the tank method. This is most commonly found in Prosecco or Moscato d'Asti. And basically, they make the wine in the tank and they don't bottle it in that same tank. They'll add that same sugar and mixture yeast aspect to get that second fermentation. And then the tank is closed off so they don't let the CO2 or the carbon dioxide release. So then they capture the bubbles that way. So it's a much more efficient way and economical way of making sparkling wine. That's why Prosecco and Moscato d'Asti tend to be much more affordable than your champagne wines and so forth. But again, these wines are nice for aperitifs, and also if you're looking to make any kind of sparkling cocktails or bellinis or so forth, things like that. You know, champagne is something that you can certainly use this in cocktails if you like, but I use the Prosecco and the Moscato for things of that nature. Well, that about does it for me today. I hope I helped unscrew the cork for you and your bottle just a bit. Please let me know if I can pour any specific education in your glass next time. Follow me on Instagram at JohnnyTastesWine and check out my website, consultantsommelier.com.